All right. Hello, students. Hope everyone's doing well today. Today, we're going to start the factor market, which is modules 69 through 73. We're going to look at, we've been talking about goods all the time. We've been talking about goods, supply and demand of goods, production possibility of goods. Then we talked about the costs, and we talked about monopolies, oligopolies, monopolistically competitive, and perfectly competitive, but overall costs. Now we're going to take a look at the factor markets, and we're going to look at how the demand for labor, the supply of labor, how much machines should we buy, or how many machines we should use, or how many acres of land we should use. So we're going to break down the cost part, and some of it's going to be very similar. We're still using back the old marginal revenue, marginal cost of things. We're still going to be producing at supply equals demand, but we're going to start to look at, like, if minimum wage is created in a perfectly competitive market, how many workers will a firm produce or hire? Or in a monopsony, not a monopoly, a monopsony. A monopsony is where there's, like, let's say there's one hospital in all of Will County, and it's the only place that doctors and nurses could work. What would they charge? What wage would they pay people? So they're going to look at how much value that people bring in to a market. So we'll take a look at that. So the first module we'll take a look at is the introduction to the factor market, which is module 69. So when we think of this module, we're going to talk about the factors of production, why the factor prices matter, factor incomes, distribution of incomes, distribution, just the cost of things. We're going to look at the value of marginal product, the value of the factor demand, the things that shift it. All right, so we're going to look at the marginal product of labor, the marginal resource costs. So we're going to take a look at those. Though there's different names that we call them, we're still essentially looking at supply and demand curves and looking at marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So we've looked at this old thing here. We've talked about the resource market is in the top half here. That's what we're looking at. Remember, we as individuals, we supply the resources, the factors of production. And the question is, how much is our factors worth? How much is our labor worth? How much physical or human capital do we have? Do we own certain things at certain times? Do we own the resources of the raw materials? So those are what we're going to look at. We're looking at this resource market. Okay. So we've been talking about the product market. Now we're going to take a look at the resource market. So when we think of the old factors of production, we talked about the things that make the goods and services that are consumed then by households. And remember, us households, we control the factors, okay? And the price that we're charging people or businesses are the factor prices, okay? So if we remember our factors of production, we had land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So land, all the natural resources that are used, labor, what were the individual people, capital. There's physical capital, such as a building. Physical capital could be the spatula used to flip a burger. But then human capital, the knowledge, the things that people have. Like if you're going to school or learning a skill, is human capital. So if I become a plumber and I learn how to do spot welding or any kind of welding, not welding, I should say soldering of copper pipes, that's a human capital. Or spot welding as an actual welder, that's human capital. If I know how to work on cars as a mechanic, that's human capital. The tools that I use, if I'm a mechanic, that's physical capital. And then once again, we always have to have entrepreneurship. The person that's taking the risk to bring together resources to innovate and create a product, a good and service. Okay, so when we think of the factor prices, we have to look at Um, the payments made for these uses of the factor products. Okay, so we know in land we have rent, in labor we have wages, capital we pay interest or fees, entrepreneurship they are paid the profit if there is, or they take the loss. So we're going to take a look at these costs that are involved. Um, so in the factor market, businesses pay individuals for the use of these resources, and that's the part of the factor market we're going to take a look at. So when we think of, once again, we've already talked about land, labor, capital, and raw materials, right? So we need to understand those are the things that we're going to look at throughout this unit. Okay. When we look at these factors, okay, and we look at these, we're going to see what we call essentially factor prices that help determine the allocation of our resources, how we use them. And what we're going to look at is something called derived demand. Okay, this idea of derived demand. This idea of derived demand results, it's derived from the output being produced. So if people want more Tesla cars, then so the demand for Tesla cars goes up, then there's going to be a derived demand for more workers to make more Tesla cars. Or if people want, right now with the pandemic, people demand more masks. So now there's a derived demand for labor to make more masks. Okay, so that is where most our largest share of income comes from the factor markets, and the derived demand is where we see this idea. Okay, so we look at how the demand is distributed, okay, and we look at this factor distribution of income is division of total income among land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Kind of like all that money, if we divided it up and looked at a pie, how much of the factor market of that money that is created goes to labor, how much of it goes to uh, 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 resources, raw materials, how much of it goes to capital. So there are markets for all of those. Okay. So the division of income among land, labor, and capital. All right. So we look at that. I have a chart here eventually that we'll look at, and we can see that um, in the United States, payments to labor is the most of this distribution. All right, that is the largest percentage of it. Because remember, if everyone worked for free, in theory, wouldn't everything be free? Because you need people to make, like, if I was going to build a house, not only do I need carpenters, but then I need the wood. Well, how did the wood get here? Well, someone had to drive it here. Well, someone had to cut down a tree. So you see all the concepts. There's labor involved in every aspect of that. So if we take a look, and everyone's going to be compensated for their use. So the more your value is, the greater value you bring to a product. In theory, then the greater you're going to be compensated. Um, just like a surgeon is going to get paid more than maybe a mechanic. A mechanic, if a car dies, you know, a mechanic isn't going to be paid as much as a brain surgeon or a heart surgeon because of that human capital that's involved. So once again, your capital, your human capital, or your physical capital, or the value of the product that you are providing for resources is going to be there's going to be a worth put upon it, and we are going to see that worth made. It's just the basic supply and demand of your resource. So if we look here, this in 2013 was essentially the breakdown of 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 all the factors distribution. So you can see the labor is the largest part of this compensation. So we like to look at what they call the marginal productivity. How much does each person bring in? You know, uh, why should or would employers hire you? You're likely to, like, because you do good work, or you do a good job. Are you productive? Are you a good worker? Are you a bad worker? What else should a employer consider when they think about hiring you? Um, what happens once you have produced a certain amount of units? Are you more productive? If your productivity goes up, like some of you want higher wages, and the real question is, if you want higher income or higher wages at your job, does that mean if they give you from a $9 to a $10 raise, would you all of a sudden do $1 more worth of work an hour? Or are you going to do the same work as you did before? Are you giving the greatest effort all the time? So we want to look at what value you bring in. So the economic decisions are about comparing costs and benefits. How much do you cost and what benefit do you bring? The producer decides whether they're going to hire an additional worker. What marginal benefit do you add to the firm? Okay. And we have to look at, if we're in a perfectly competitive market for labor, then producers are price takers. They're going to take that market price of a perfectly competitive labor for whatever field you're in. Or if we're in what they call a monopsony, which is like a monopoly for labor, a monopsony, they are more of price makers. Okay. So if we look here on the left, we see a total product. So if we look at the quantities of bushels, this is the same Georgia Martha's farm that's been in your entire textbook. And we look at, as we hire more workers, they keep the total product keeps going up. But we have the law of diminishing marginal returns, so the total product lessens. So what we want to do is we want to look at your marginal product of labor, the marginal product, like how much additional labor or how much additional product does each laborer make? And you see that's downward sloping here because the law of diminishing marginal return. So we can see essentially the eighth worker is only bringing in like 5, where the first worker is bringing like 19 or 20. So we can see that your value, we're not saying that the eighth worker is worse than the first worker, but because of certain limited resources, if I had a landscaping business and I only had 3 lawnmowers and I hired 5 people, well, I only have 3 lawnmowers. So then what are the others going to do? So that's something to consider. So, what is the optimal number of workers that George and Martha should hire? Because they still were having, if you go back and look, they still are producing more goods. Total product is still going up with the eighth worker. But should they continue to hire more and more? And it really depends upon the price, what value these individuals bring to the workplace. So, what we want to do is we want to look at the value of marginal product. Okay. This is essentially what value they bring in. It essentially creates like this demand curve. The marginal revenue product, or the marginal product of labor, right? It's the marginal revenue. We look at the value that they bring, right? The value of the marginal product. So the marginal product of labor is how much additional product they bring times the price of that product, and that gives us the value, right? This is the marginal revenue product of labor, or the marginal product of labor. How much additional value does an additional worker bring to the firm? So, in a general rule, we tend to want to produce where supply equals demand. So we're looking at the cost benefit analysis. Um, the cost being essentially the supply curve, and the benefit being the demand curve. And we want to be at equilibrium. Now, in a perfectly competitive market for labor, the wage is essentially given to the firm. Okay, so in general rule, the profit maximizing is the price taking producers employs each factor of production up to the point at which the value of the marginal product of the last unit of factor or employed is equal to the factor's price. Okay, so here we go. if we go back and we look at the number of workers and we look at how much, like the first worker, they make 19, two workers, they make 36, three, they make 51, four, they make 64. So this is total product right here. Then we have the value, or I should say, the marginal product of labor here. How much additional? So, like the eighth worker only brings five additional. We're not saying the eighth worker sucks. We're just saying that because of diminishing marginal returns, we know over time these numbers will fall. So the question is, how many workers do we hire? Okay, that's really the question. And so we take a look at, if we look here, okay, and if we look at the marginal product of labor times the price of it, okay, so if we take, what is that, uh, uh, we're saying here, let me get my marker down, that the, the product, the bushels are $20. Of course, my marker, my pen, oh, shoot, didn't do that. Is that the price essentially per bushel is $20. So we take the 20, which is the marginal revenue, that's the marginal revenue, right? How much additional? So we take 20 times 19 is 380, 20 times 17 is 340, and so on. 20 times 15 is 300, 20 times 30 is, and we go all the way down. So 20 times 5 is 100, and we go on and on, and we times everything by 20, because that's the essential marginal revenue. It's perfectly competitive, the wheat, right? So we take the $20 times each of that, and this is essentially the marginal revenue product of labor. This is the value of what each worker is bringing to the firm. So if we go ahead and we graph that, here is our marginal revenue product of labor. Okay. Now, if we're in a perfectly competitive market and the market wage rate is $200 per worker, then what's going to happen is, if essentially this is the demand curve, essentially this downward sloping to the right is the demand curve. If the wage rate is essentially, the cost is constant here at $200, then that's essentially the supply curve. So right here, the optimal point, they're going to hire five workers. Now, if the cost of the wheat were to go up, all right, if the cost of wheat per bushel went up, then the demand curve, this marginal revenue product of labor, the value of it, you would turn around, if it went up by $5 per bushel from 20 to 25, then this curve would shift to the right. This curve would shift. Of course, the marker stopped working. It would shift to the right, and if it shifted to the right, we'd hire more workers. If the bushels of wheat were to fall to $10, half the price, then the whole curve would shift to the left, and we would hire less workers at the wage of $200 per day. At the wage of $200. Now, if the wages fell in general, then we could hire more people. If people, went on strike and says we want higher wages, look what happens. Higher wages, if they went up to $300, they would hire less people. They'd hire less people. Well, that might be more right here. I don't know. They would hire less people. So once again, when you're somebody asking for higher wages, you have to be careful that you're not going to lose your job. Okay. So here in this example here, it shows the marginal product of labor, which is essentially the demand curve for labor, and then the wage rate, which is the marginal resource cost, which is a supply curve. So we're going to hire, essentially, if this is the wage that's given to us, right? Wage equals marginal product of labor is going to be the amount of workers that we hire. Okay. So once again, what do we say causes the demand curve to shift? Changes in the price of good, the supply of other factors, technology. I go into a little more detail here. So once again, the three shifts: change in the demand for the product. So if there's a change in the demand for the product, that means the prices of the product increase, or the demand for the resources shift. Okay. So If the product goes up, demand goes up for it, that means the price of it's going to go up. Therefore, if the price of it goes up, then we can hire more workers. Change in productivity. Let's say there's new technology that makes people more efficient, then they can produce more products. So then essentially their total output or their marginal product will change. And then other resources, like if there's a substitute resource, like what happens to the demand for assembly lines, workers if the price of robots fall? Well, if the price of robots fall, we're going to hire less workers. Um, or if the price of robots go up, we'll hire more workers. Complementary resources, like what happens if what happens to the demand for nails if the price of lumber increases? Well, if the price of lumber increases, the demand for nails is going to decrease, and if the demand for nails decreases, then they're not going to hire as many people for, let's say, nails to produce nails. Okay, so here we could take a look. If there's an increase in the price of wheat, we could see that we know the law of diminishing marginal returns, we're still going to be downward sloping on the right, but you can see that if there's an increase in the price, we're going to hire more workers. Whereas here, if we have a decrease in the price of wheat, we're going to hire less workers. Okay. So, but now that's in a perfectly competitive market. Okay. A perfectly competitive market for labor. Okay. So when we think of a perfectly competitive market of labor, we can think of this. Of course, the pen is not working. So we have the demand and supply of labor. So who demands labor? Firms. Who supplies labor? Us, the consumers. So this sets the wage in a perfectly competitive market. So then we come over here to the individual firm, and here essentially is the wage, which is the marginal revenue cost, all right, of the products. So this is the wage or the supply of it, and then we have the marginal revenue product of labor, which is the demand curve. So this is what a perfectly competitive market for labor looks like. But when we're talking about a monopsony, which is an imperfect market, remember when we did the old Monopoly where we said it's like downward sloping like this and we're like this? It's the exact opposite of that. It's a mirror. So in a in a monopsony, it would look like this, right? So we would have essentially the supply curve here, the marginal cost curve here, and then this would be the demand curve here. So this is what a monopsony, and I'm going to go through all that, but that's what a monopsony would look like, where like there's one hospital in all of the neighborhood in the whole community, and that's the only place you as a doctor you can work. Here, this is maybe a basic laborer, working at a perfectly competitive market. So if we take a look here, we take a look at this one. You have to understand that the marginal, if we look at the marginal product, so we have output, right? Here's the output, right? Increase in output. We have the marginal product of labor, okay? Here's the marginal product of labor. But if we are at a monopsony, remember, or a monopoly, it's down, the demand curve downward sloping. Remember we talked about how if it's downward sloping, the marginal revenue curve is on the inside. Well, that's sort of the same thing here of the marginal revenue product of labor in an imperfect, like a monopsony. So we know the price falls as we fall down here, right? The price of the product falls. So then if the price falls to produce more and more, so here's the thing, for us to continue to producing more and more products, don't we keep falling down in the price here? right? As we produce more products, the price falls. Well, here's the price falling. See, the price is falling here as we produce more and more. So what happens is our total revenue is $10 times the $20 gives us a total revenue of 200. 39 times 980 is 382. 57 times 9. So we can see because of this, our total revenue is falling. But whoa, look, it goes back up because we know the top half of this line is inelastic. The top half of this line is elastic. The bottom half of this line is inelastic. But then we have to look at the marginal revenue that is created. Well, we look at the marginal revenue that is created, which is the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. So this change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity, well, change in quantity is 19, 18, 16, 13. So you have differences of numbers here. So then you take those differences of number following this equation, you take the marginal product of labor, right, times the marginal revenue, right, because here's the marginal revenue, right, the marginal product of labor, okay, and we divide that and we see that this number here is different. It's not going to be the same as the demand curve. So we're going to see some different things here. And I'll go a little bit more into detail. I have some graphs to show you that. Okay. So if we take a look here, after which worker does the diminishing marginal product occur first? This is the pounds per hour. So where do we see that happen? That's after the third worker. So we went from 0 to 3. So it's 3. 3 to 7 is 4, right? 7 to 3 or 7 to 10 is 3. So that's where we see the law of diminishing marginal return. It says if the firm can sell as many potatoes as it wants for $2 per pound, and has to pay each worker $5 per hour, how many workers would the firm employ to maximize profit? Ooh, what is that? So if we take a look at the marginal product, so if the marginal product here is 3, of course my marker and thing doesn't work. 3, come on. Oh, of course it already did that. So if we look here, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, negative 1. We would definitely not consider this one. No way, right? So then we said, how much is it's $2. The firm wants $2 per pound. So what is the value of the marginal product of labor? So 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 4 is 8. Or not, or I'm sorry, it's 2 times 4 is 8. It's $2 here. 2 times 3 oh wait, hold on. Yeah. 6, 4, 4, 2. And then it says, how much are they paying the wage? So right now, these numbers right here, we essentially made this curve, which is the marginal product of labor. And then we have this wage of $5 coming across like that. So essentially, they're going to hire the third worker. All right. They're going to hire the third worker. They won't hire the fourth worker because the worker you have to pay $5 and they only bring in 4. Right. You pay them 5, but you'll hire the third worker because their marginal product of labor is greater than. Realistically, you want your marginal product of labor to equal your marginal resource cost, which is sort of like the old marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay. So if we talk about the perfect competition in the resource market, okay, perfect competition for labor, as we talked about before, small firms, many small firms hiring workers, right? No one firm is large enough to manipulate the market of workers. Uh, Workers have basically the same skills, right? The wage is constant, and the workers are wage takers. Okay, just like the firms, they're not really the wage makers either. They're taking the wage that the market gives them. So firms can hire as many workers as they want at a wage set by the industry. So that'll so when we look at it, if this is the industry right here, this is the industry, this is the supply of labor, and this is the demand of labor, the market wage rate is $10. So this wage rate would come all the way across here and essentially be the wage rate, right? This here, though, this would be the supply curve essentially for a perfectly competitive market for the labor. Okay. So if there's a significant increase in the demand for pizza, how would this affect the demand for cheese? Let's think about this. If there's a significant increase in the demand for pizza, how would that affect the demand for cheese? Well, we know the demand for cheese would go up, right? Same with cows, milking machines, uh, veterinarians to make sure the cows are good, possibly vet schools, all these things. These are essentially derived demand, right? Um, and if there's an increase in demand for cars, increases demand for what? If we have an increase for cars, what else will that create more jobs of? We get derived demand, and that could be for cars. We're going to need more mechanics. We're going to need more gas stations. We're going to need more places that fix cars or replaces tires, oil change places. Those are derived demands based upon a product that people want. Okay. Um, so that's derived demand. Okay. So when we think of a worker, we have this thing called the marginal resource cost. Okay, the additional cost of an additional resource. In this case, we're talking about workers. In perfectly competitive labor markets, the marginal resource cost is equal to the wage set by the market. Okay, so if the unskilled worker is currently the marginal resource cost of unskilled workers is 875, that's how much it's going to be worth, like what they're going to be paid. Now, essentially, to figure that out, we could say the marginal resource cost is the change in total cost divided by the change in inputs. And this essentially, if we're talking about change in labor, we're talking about change in inputs, the amount of workers that we're hiring. Okay. So and so that's marginal resource cost. That's like essentially the wages. Okay. Now I think what's minimum wage, 9 something. I think next year it goes to 10 something. Um, Marginal revenue product. All right, this is essentially the value, the marginal revenue product, or the marginal product of labor. Some people call it the marginal product of labor. This is how much additional revenue the resource, the labor, adds to the market. Okay. So if the marginal product of the third worker is 5 and the price is $20, then they've brought in $100. So their value, their marginal product of labor is $100. Another way to calculate that is the change in total revenue divided by the change in input. And once again, this change in input is the workers. So why does the marginal revenue eventually fall? We know diminishing marginal returns. It's like a demand curve because it's sort of like the benefits. Remember the old cost benefit analysis we talked about? Benefit was that downward sloping to the right curve. Cost was that upward sloping to the right curve. But when we're talking about labor in a perfectly competitive market, that supply curve is straight across because the market determines the price. Okay, so the marginal revenue product of labor determines the demand for labor. It's the firm's willingness and ability to pay for people. Okay. And each worker has a certain amount that they're valued at. Okay. So, how do you know how many resources or workers to employ? Well, we continue to hire until marginal resource product is equal to the marginal resource cost, right? We're essentially looking at where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, or where supply equals demand, or where cost equals the cost equals the benefit. Okay, so here again, this is what we're talking about. The left here graph is the industry for perfectly competitive laborers in the labor market. Okay, so if we look, this downward sloping demand curve is the marginal product of labor. So what we did was we calculated the marginal product of people. So if we think about this individual firm right here, this individual firm right, come on, pen. This individual this individual this downward sloping, what we did is we took the total product, right? And as we hired more and more workers, 3, 4, 5, 6 workers, right? Then we looked at their total product, right? How much additional, then we looked at their marginal product, how much each additional worker, then we took that marginal product and we times it by the price of the product that they're making, and that creates this graph here, the marginal revenue product of labor, and that's essentially the demand curve. This supply curve of labor is the marginal resource cost, and once again, we said this is technically the change in the marginal cost of labor is essentially the change in cost divided by the change in labor. So this is right here straight across. So we're going to hire this amount of workers right here. This is equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market for labor. Okay. So this is a side by side graph showing the market and the firm in the labor market. Okay. So let's redefine it, right? The demand for labor is the willingness and ability of businesses to hire uh, different workers. Okay, the law of demand for labor has an inverse relationship with wages and the quantity, right? The supply of labor we know is based on individuals, and we remember our old circular flow chart, that are willing and able to essentially sell their labor at different wages. Okay, and it's upward sloping to the right typically, but in that's when we saw the industries was upward sloping to the right, but for the firm it's flat straight across. So it has more of a direct or positive relationship. Okay, so workers have a trade-off between work or leisure, and how much are they willing to get paid. So if we look at wages here, theoretically, you can take the demand curve of these different firms in the fast food industry and add up their demand curves to get this market demand curve. So at $8, they're hiring three. At $8, they're hiring two. $8, these other ones are hiring 25. So the market demand is 30. Okay. So once again, who demands labor? Firms demand labor, right? They demand labor. The market demand for labor is the sum of each firm's the marginal product of labor. Okay, so as wages fall, quantity demand increases. As wages increase, quantity demand falls. So we're going up and down this demand curve. Okay, who supplies labor? Individuals. This is once again from our circular flow chart, right? Higher wages give workers incentives to leave industries. And believe it or not, we can actually see a problem if you pay people too much money, they might actually give up work time for leisure time. So we normally see, this is a typical labor supply of labor curve. Higher wages, people work more hours. But there are times where I'll show you, it can change. It can curve back. So once again, in a perfectly competitive market, okay, perfectly competitive market, this is the demand for labor, the supply of labor. And then what happens is they come up with an equilibrium price. Here's equilibrium for a carpenter, $30 an hour. So this is the industry. So now every firm theoretically has to hire all carpenters at $30 an hour. Okay, right there. Okay. So individual firms then, if that was the $30 from the previous page, $30 would come here, and this would be the supply curve for the individual firm. the carpet, the house building place, and they'd have to pay everyone $30 an hour. And then they have to look at how much does each worker bring benefit to them. And this would create the equilibrium spot for the individual firm. So you hire workers to mow lawns. The wage for each worker is set up for $100 a day. Each lawn mowed earns your firm $50. You hire one worker, he can mow 4 lawns. You hire 2 workers, they can mow 5 lawns per day. So, what is your marginal revenue cost for each worker? Okay, what is the first workers? What is the second worker marginal? How much is each worker's? What are you willing to pay? Now, if we take a look, the wage for each worker is $100. Okay, so the first worker. So what is your marginal cost for each worker? Well, that's 100. Oh, of course, my pen doesn't work. Is $100, right? $100. $100. $100. Come on. Ooh, come on. $100. What is the first worker's marginal revenue per product? So the higher the first worker, he can mow 4 lawns, right? So his marginal product is 4, right? So now 4 times the $50 that he's getting for each lawn. So this guy's value 4 times 50 is $200. Come on. Why? Oh, jeez, oh, Pete. Is $200. But then it says, what about the second worker? Well, the second one, if you hire 2 workers, they can mow 5 lawns per day together. So this guy only brings in his marginal product is 1 lawn, 1 lawn. So 1 lawn times 50 is only $50. But what are we doing? We're paying him 100, right? So how many workers will you hire? Well, you're only going to hire 1 right now. But how much are you willing to pay the first worker? Well, given just this data, right, you could essentially you could pay him more, couldn't you? Right? You could pay him more. But what are you actually paying the first worker? You're only paying the first worker $100, right? Because that's how much each worker is set, right? The wage for each worker is set. What must happen to the wage in the market for you to hire that second worker? The wage would have to fall dramatically because he's only bringing right now, because the lawns are only $50. Um, you got to pay him 100, so the wage would have to fall to $50 for you to hire that second worker. So that's why it's important to understand what you're worth. So here you are, you're in a business. Okay. You're selling a product, a perfectly competitive product at a price constant of $10. Your wage is constantly $20. And assume the wage is your only cost right now. Okay. And to maximize your profit, how many workers should you hire? Okay. So here we go. Price is $10, or the wage is 20. So here we go. Here's the total product of that they're making. The first person's able to make 7. The second person, between the two of them, they make 17. So here's total product. This is number of workers. So how much is each worker worth? So, well, we first have to look at what is happening to the total product. We see the total product going up until we get to the 7th worker. And the 7th worker, we're not going to hire him because we see the total product fall. We're definitely not hiring a 7th worker. Okay. And we know we start to see the law of diminishing marginal returns happen, right? And then, when we think of the 3 stages of any kind of growth, righty, stage 1, we would see happening up to point 1 here, right? Or I'm sorry, to worker 2, because we are increasing at an increasing rate. Then from because we go up by 10 here, and then we go from 17 to 24. Oops, well, that's the marginal product is getting less. So stage 1 goes to here, then stage 2 goes to here, and then this is stage 3. Okay. So if we look at a marginal product, we can see, here we go. So once again, here's the marginal product, stage 1, stage 2, and then this is stage 3. Okay, because we're increasing at a decreasing rate here from 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the marginal product is here. We said the price of the product are $10. So what is the value that each worker brings? What is the value that each worker brings? Okay, so this shows the productivity of each worker, but now we want to know what is the um, uh, why does productivity decrease? We know law of diminishing marginal returns. The product price is $10, like we said right here. So what is the value of them, right? This is constant because it's a perfectly competitive product. So here is the value, the marginal product of labor, the marginal of a revenue product of labor. And we can see here. So we see this is going to be, you remember how the marginal cost curve, when we used to talk about before, used to be like this? Well, now that's kind of what the marginal cost curve will look like. Well, now this marginal revenue product curve is going to look a little like this. Whoa, it'll look like this. Okay. So now the question is, you know, this shows how much each worker's worth. Well, the marginal cost is $20, right? The wage, each additional worker, we're paying an additional $20. So the question is, how many workers are we going to hire? How many workers are we going to hire? We're going to hire 5 workers. We're going to hire 5 workers. Now, if this product price went up to $10, or I'm sorry, to $15, this number would be greater. Therefore, we could actually hire more workers. If the product price fell, we would probably hire less workers. Okay. If wages went up to $30 an hour, we'd only hire 4. If wages fell to $10 an hour, then we could hire 6. So once again, depending upon the wage rate, it'll determine how many workers we can that we would hire. So here's another example. Okay, you're making pizza $10. The wage is $20. I have some different numbers here. Assume that the only wage is your costs. So here we go to profit. How many workers should you hire? Well, here we go. Here's our total product. Oops. So what is our marginal product here? Our marginal product. So we know here it's 5. Why does that keep doing that? This is 7. 7. Oh gosh, darn it! Why does it keep doing that? Here it's 4, 4. Oh, geez. 4, 1, and -2. So we know. Oh my gosh, I am going to have. So we know we're not going to hire the 5th worker. Okay. Oh my God. It keeps going back and forth. So now, if we look right here, I'm going to use this instead. So, we know their cost is $20. $20. Oh my gosh. $20 the whole way down here. $20. And then, so what we do is we take this marginal product times the $10. So 5 times 10 is 50. 7 times 10 is 70. 4 times 10 is 40. 1 times 10 is 10. Well, we're not going to hire the 10th or the 4th worker because they only bring in $10 and the cost is greater than them. So how many workers are we going to hire? We're going to hire 3 workers. I don't know why this clicker is jacked up. All right. So the thing here to remember is we want to look at the factors of production. We want to look at the physical and the human capital. We should be able to calculate the marginal product of labor, the marginal resource cost. That's kind of the big thing from this module. If we go ahead and we look at the worksheets, if we take a look at 69.1, there's a video and that's online. So if you watch the video, it says here, When economists refer to resources, what is the most important thing to remember that distinguishes these items as resources? Resources are used to make goods, to produce goods and services. Number two, besides physical dirt and soil, give other examples of resources of land from the video: trees, livestock, wind, plants, sun, water, oil. Those are given as examples in the video. Number three, if we count only physical product under the resources of labor, would we be correct? Why or why not? No, we must include intellectual labor services as well. Talking about our human resources. Number four, is money considered a capital resource? Why or why not? No. Money by itself is not productive. It can only be used to acquire resources that can produce goods and services. Number five, if money is not an economic capital resource, what is? Capital resources include manufacturing plants, offices, equipment, machinery, infrastructure, transportation, utilities. Those are part of capital resources. What is an entrepreneurial ability? Entrepreneur is one who can recognize profit opportunities, organize the resources or the factors needed, and willing to take that risk to make that product. Okay. Number 69.2, hiring workers. Once again, I'm not sure if the writing will work here, probably not. But given this data, you're supposed to fill out the chart. So here the price is $5, the wage is 40. So given this chart, here is the output. So if we look at the marginal product, it's 0, then it goes 12, 15, 8, 2, and -5. So we know we're not going to hire the fifth worker. The marginal revenue product, right? That's the value. So we said the price was $5. So we will take that 12, that's right here, times 5, which is 60. Then we take the 15 times 5, which is 75. Then the 8 times 5 is 40. And the 2 times 5 is 10. And once again, we wouldn't hire this guy because it's a negative, right? And we know the marginal cost is 40 all the way down because that is the wage rate. So, given that information, what is the equation used to determine the number of workers? It's going to be the marginal revenue product is equal to the marginal resource cost. Like MR equals MC. Okay. How many workers will this firm hire? They're going to hire 3 workers because the marginal revenue product and the marginal resource costs are both equal to $40 at the third worker. And number 4, calculate the profit this firm will be earning based on the number of workers hired that you indicated in 3. Well, in 3, so worker 3, with 3 workers, they're producing 3 workers are producing 35 units, right? They're producing 35 units of products. 35 times 5 is what? What is that? 100, right? 35 is $175, right? And then they're hiring 3 workers and they're paying them a total of $120, right? So their total revenue is 175 minus 120 for the firm. So the profit that they're earning is $55. Okay. The profit they're earning is $55 at that point, right? 135 minus 120 or 175 minus 120. The next one, given this total product of labor, given this table, it says figure it out here. The stands, they tell you that sell bushels of peaches. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to write down the marginal product and then the marginal revenue product of labor. So we know that essentially the market output, the price of each bushel is $15. So we can figure out how much that they're worth. So the marginal product here for the first one is 6, then it goes 7, then 6, then 5, then 4, then 3. And then if you calculate the marginal product of labor, it'd be 90, 105, 90, 75, 60, and 45, because all I did was take the marginal product times the $15. So it says add your own column for marginal product and calculate the marginal product of the quantities of each labor, which we just did. And then it says number two, what is the marginal product of the third worker? The marginal product is 6 because the second worker, because with the second worker, they were at 13 and the third worker's at 19. So the marginal product is 6. Number three says, now add the columns to calculate the marginal revenue, which we did. And it says, if each worker at the farm stand is hired for a competitive market at a wage rate of $65 a day, how many workers would you hire? You would only hire the fifth worker. Well, if the wage rate is 65, the marginal product there is 60, um, you'd actually hire the fourth worker because the cost of 65 would be greater than, so you'd hire 4 workers because you don't want the cost to be greater than their marginal product of labor. So you'd hire the fourth worker. All right, you'd hire the fourth worker. Okay, 4 workers are going to be hired because hiring the fifth worker only brings you $60, but the firm costs the cost of labor 65. So you're going to only hire 4 workers. Okay, so that's that one. Then this one says here, what are the three factors the three factors that shift the factor demand? Changes in the price of the product produced with the factor, changes in the supply of other factors, and changes in technology. So, given those things here, they're asking you what's going to happen here. So it says new technology is introduced in the ABC company that increases each worker's marginal product. So that's a change in technology, and that would the direction uh, of the change in the demand for labor that increases it. So it shift right. Number two, it says the cost of new equipment for boxing the cereal decreases, and the company laid off 1 worker after buying the new equipment. This is a change in the supply of other factors, so that would decrease it. Number three, new demand for an organic cereal has increased the price of the product. This is a change in the price of the product producing with other factors, and that would increase it. Number four, the Organic Medical Journal touted organic cereal as a healthier choice of breakfast. This is a change in the price of the product producing with the factor that would increase it. Number five, there's an increase in the price of peaches used to make peach pie. Changes in the supply of other factors that would decrease it. Um, Six, improved technology has raised the productivity of auto assembly line workers. That's a change in technology that would increase it. And then here, the wage rate decreases. That would be none because that would just, the demand curve essentially would stay the same. Demand curve for labor would stay the same. That would just be the wage shifting downward. And then they would actually hire more because that's a change in quantity demanded. Okay. And then the last page is the exit slip here. So let's take a look at the exit slip. Um, it says here a factor of production is B, the resources used by the firms to produce goods and services. Two, the factor markets and goods markets are similar with the exception that D, the demand for factors is a derived demand. And then three, the extra value of output generated by employing one more unit of labor is known as the marginal revenue product of labor. That's D. Okay. All right. Well, it's been kind of a long video, but hopefully this will help you with Module 69. Thank you. Have a great day. Be safe.